The morning sun was just starting to rise over Dubai, casting a golden light over the glass buildings that touched the sky. In the heart of the city stood a tall, beautiful tower, known as the Al Mansouri Tech Center. It was a place filled with energy, ideas, and people from all over the world. Everyone knew it belonged to Layla Al Mansouri, a successful and well-known Arab businesswoman who had built her empire from the ground up. She was respected not just for her intelligence, but also for her kindness. Many called her the Queen of Innovation. That day, Layla arrived at her office early, as she often did. She liked to walk through the building quietly before the day began. It gave her time to think. The floors were shiny, the walls spotless, and the silence peaceful. As she passed the lobby, something unusual caught her attention. A man in a blue, janitor uniform stood near the front desk, talking on his phone in French. He spoke fluently, without hesitation. His words flowed so smoothly that Layla stopped without realizing it. She didn't understand everything he said, but she recognized the sound and rhythm of the language. She was impressed. French wasn't an easy language to learn. Curious, she stood there for a moment longer. A delivery man approached the janitor with a question. Without missing a beat, the janitor switched from French to Mandarin Chinese and gave clear directions. Layla's eyes widened. Now her curiosity was fully awake. She had been around educated people all her life. She had spoken to CEOs, professors, scientists. But it was rare, even in those circles, to meet someone who could speak both French and Mandarin so naturally. And here was a janitor, standing with a mop, doing just that. Quietly, she stepped closer. She waited for a moment when he finished his call and asked him politely, "Excuse me, I heard you speaking just now. Do you speak Arabic?" The man turned toward her with a calm smile. "Yes, ma'am. I speak Arabic," he said in perfect modern standard Arabic. Layla was shocked, but not in a bad way. More like amazed. She wasn't used to people answering her in such flawless Arabic outside formal meetings or academic settings. She continued, speaking with him, now more interested than ever. As they talked, she learned that his name was David Mensah. He had been working in the building as a janitor for the past 2 years. She gently asked, "How many languages do you speak, David?" He looked thoughtful for a moment, then replied modestly, "About 12, I think. Some better than others." 12? She asked, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am," he said kindly. "English, Arabic, French, Mandarin, Spanish, German, Russian, Swahili, Japanese, and a few more." Layla could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had met translators and scholars who spent their whole lives studying languages, and most of them knew 5 or 6 well. But 12? That was rare. And to think this man was working as a janitor, unnoticed by everyone. "Where did you learn all of them?" she asked, genuinely interested. David shared that he had been born in Ghana, where he grew up speaking multiple local languages. He had always loved words and sounds. As a young man, he studied linguistics at a university and later became a professor. He traveled and taught in several countries, but due to political problems and changes in his home country, he had to leave everything behind and move to Dubai for safety. When he arrived, he couldn't get a job in education because he didn't have the right papers or contacts. He needed to support his family, so he took the first job he could find, janitorial work. He didn't complain. He said it gave him peace, time to think, and a way to keep his dignity. Every day as he cleaned the halls of the tech center, he listened to podcasts, read books, and practiced his languages. It was a quiet life, but not an unhappy one. Layla listened closely. Something inside her shifted. She was used to being surrounded by bright minds, but this man's story moved her in a way she hadn't expected. There was something about his calm, humble way of speaking. He didn't brag or try to impress her. He was just being honest. By now, a few staff members had entered the building and were quietly watching from a distance. They were surprised to see their boss standing and chatting with the janitor. But Layla didn't notice them. She was too focused on the conversation. She asked him questions in different languages, Spanish, then Russian, then German, and each time, he responded smoothly. It was like watching someone play beautiful music with words. Finally, she smiled and said, "David, you have an amazing gift. I don't think the world knows what it's missing." He chuckled softly and said, "Sometimes the world doesn't know what it's looking at, ma'am." There was silence for a moment, a respectful, thoughtful silence. Then Layla said something unexpected. "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" David looked surprised, even a little confused. "Dinner, ma'am?" "Yes," she said warmly. "I'd like to hear more about your life, if that's okay with you." People nearby glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. A few whispered quietly, but Layla didn't care what anyone thought. Something had stirred in her heart. She felt she had just discovered a diamond where no one thought to look. David hesitated, then nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. I'd be honored." As she walked away, Layla couldn't stop thinking about what she had just seen and heard. It felt like the beginning of something important, though she didn't yet know what. All she knew was that this man, this quiet janitor, was more than he appeared. Much more. And soon the world would know it too. That evening, Layla Al-Mansouri sat at a quiet table in a rooftop restaurant, looking out at the beautiful lights of Dubai. The sky was slowly turning dark, and the stars were just beginning to show. It had been a long day, but her mind was still thinking about David Mensa, the janitor who spoke 12 languages and had once been a university professor. It was hard to believe that someone so brilliant had been walking through her building unnoticed for 2 years. She glanced at her watch. David was right on time. He arrived dressed simply but neatly, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers. His shoes were polished, and he walked with calm confidence. Layla stood up and greeted him with a warm smile. "I'm really glad you came," she said. "Thank you for inviting me, ma'am," David replied, bowing his head respectfully. They sat down, and a kind waiter brought them water. At first, there was a quiet moment between them. It wasn't awkward, just thoughtful. Then Layla began the conversation gently. "Tell me more about your past," she said. "How did you end up here?" David smiled softly. "Well, my story is long, but I'll keep it simple." He explained that he was born in a small town in Ghana. His father was a school teacher, and his mother sold handmade clothes at the market. They didn't have much, but they valued education. From a young age, David showed a love for learning, especially languages. He would listen to the radio and try to copy the accents. He'd borrow books from neighbors, even if he didn't understand all the words. At university, he studied linguistics and soon became known for his gift with languages. After graduating with honors, he was offered a teaching position. He later earned scholarships to study in Europe and Asia, which helped him learn even more languages and cultures. "Words are like music to me," he said. "Each language is a different melody." Layla listened with great interest. She sipped her tea, deeply moved. "And then?" she asked. David's smile faded just a little. He explained that after returning home, political changes in his country made life difficult. Schools were closed, professors were laid off, and many families struggled. Some of his writings were misunderstood, and he found himself out of work. With no stable income and a family to support, he looked for opportunities abroad. That's how he came to Dubai. But with no formal job connections and papers that didn't match his past titles, he took the first job he could get, cleaning offices. "I told myself it was still honest work," he said. "Even if it wasn't what I dreamed of, I could still learn something every day." Layla looked at him with admiration. Most people would have given up or grown bitter. But David had stayed calm, kept learning, and kept his dignity. "I'm warm." "Not sure many people would have that kind of patience," she said. David simply replied, "Sometimes patience is the only thing a man can afford." They laughed gently. Then Layla asked something unexpected. "Do you miss teaching?" David nodded slowly. "Every day. Teaching isn't just about sharing knowledge. It's about lighting a flame in someone else, seeing a student's eyes, light up when they understand something new. That's priceless. Layla felt something stir inside her. She had built her tech company on talent, people who could think big, solve problems, and communicate across borders. But David's story reminded her of something deeper. It reminded her that the greatest talents are sometimes hidden in places no one looks. "I want to offer you something," she said after a pause. David looked surprised. "Ma'am?" Layla leaned in slightly. "I run a foundation that supports education in underdeveloped areas. We've been trying to start a language and culture program online, but we've struggled to find someone who understands both the teaching and the human side of it. I think you could lead it." David blinked. He wasn't sure he had heard her right. "You want me to lead a program?" "Yes," she said clearly. "Not as a janitor, as a teacher, as a director, as the person who designs and guides it. You've lived the challenges, you've mastered the skills, and most importantly, you understand people." There was a long silence between them, the kind of silence that happens when something big is happening, even if no one speaks. David slowly placed his hands on the table and said, "This is more than I ever expected." Layla smiled. "Maybe, but it's exactly what the world needs." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked out over the city lights. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to dream of moments like this. But after a while, I thought those dreams were just memories. It's strange how life circles back." She nodded. "Sometimes life waits for the right time to open the right door." By the end of the meal, they had made a plan. Layla would arrange for David to meet with her foundation's team the following week. They would begin designing a pilot program, something small at first, but with the hope of growing. David would return home that night, not just with hope, but with purpose. As they stood up to leave, Layla thanked him again. "I think this is the beginning of something powerful," she said. David looked at her and replied, "I hope we can turn quiet talent into loud impact." They shook hands, not as employer and worker, but as partners. Two people from different worlds brought together by a conversation in the most unexpected place. What neither of them knew at that moment was that their meeting would not just change their own lives, it would begin to touch the lives of thousands around the world. Outside, the city continued to glow, unaware of what had just begun. The next morning, David Mensah woke up earlier than usual. Even though he had slept for only a few hours, he felt more awake than ever. His heart was full of hope, and his mind kept going back to the night before, his dinner with Layla Al-Mansouri. For the first time in many years, he felt like his knowledge, his voice, and his life experience truly mattered again. He put on his usual uniform and walked to the building just as the sun was rising. Everything looked the same: the smooth floors, the shiny glass, the quiet hallways, but something inside him had changed. For years, he had silently walked those same halls with a mop in hand. Now, he was walking with a purpose far greater. When he reached the janitor's room to clock in, his coworkers greeted him the same way they always did, but they noticed something different in his eyes. He seemed taller somehow, lighter. "David," one of them said, "you look happy today." David smiled and simply said, "It's a good day." Meanwhile, Layla sat in a meeting room on the top floor, already planning the first steps. She had spoken to her foundation's board early in the morning, explaining David's story and her vision for a new language learning program. While a few board members were unsure, most of them trusted her instincts. Layla had a reputation for finding hidden gems, and her success in business had proven her ability to turn ideas into results. By noon, she invited David upstairs for an informal meeting with her education team. He had never been to the top floor before. As he rode the elevator, he looked at his reflection in the shiny doors and took a deep breath. He wasn't nervous, just curious. A small smile stayed on his face the entire ride up. The doors opened, and he was welcomed warmly by Layla and a group of 5 people. They were researchers, developers, and program managers, all passionate about education. Layla introduced David not as a janitor, but as a language expert and future project leader. Everyone stood up to shake his hand. They sat around a long table and David shared his ideas. He spoke with clarity and humility. He explained how language could open minds and connect hearts. He talked about how children in underdeveloped countries, refugees, and even workers like himself could grow if given access to the right kind of learning. He imagined online lessons that used stories, culture, and music to teach, not just grammar and vocabulary. Everyone listened carefully. One of the team members asked, "How would we reach people with low internet access?" David smiled and replied, "Through audio lessons, low bandwidth apps, and even small community centers with shared devices. Language doesn't need fancy tools, it just needs to be spoken and shared." By the end of the meeting, there was excitement in the room. The team could feel it. Something new was beginning. Not just another education project, but something more human, more meaningful. Layla looked at David with pride. "You've just built the heart of the program," she said. "We'll build the structure around it." But not everyone outside the room was as open-minded. Later that day, news began to spread. A few employees had seen David going into the executive meeting. Whispers turned into stories, and stories became gossip. Some said Layla was making a mistake. Others couldn't believe that a janitor would be asked to lead a program. A few people online, after hearing the story through social media, questioned David's background. Was he really who he said he was? Could he truly speak 12 languages? Layla was used to criticism, but this felt different. She hadn't expected people to question David's intelligence or story so quickly. Still, she remained calm. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and she believed in showing the world what quiet brilliance looked like. So she made a decision. She invited journalists to the tech center and announced a small press conference. She called it a conversation about talent. When the day came, reporters gathered in the lobby. They were expecting a regular event. What they didn't expect was what happened next. Layla walked to the front with David at her side. She introduced him briefly and said, "You may not know this man, but he's worked here for 2 years. What you also don't know is that he speaks 12 languages and has taught in multiple countries. I want you to meet him not just as a janitor, but as a teacher." Then she stepped aside and let David speak. At first, there was silence, but David, with his usual calm, looked at the reporters and began speaking in Arabic. Then he switched to French, then to Mandarin, then to Russian, Spanish, Swahili, and Japanese. Each time he addressed someone in the audience using their native language. People's eyes widened. Some began to clap. Others looked stunned. The video clip of that moment was shared online, and it quickly went viral. By the end of the week, millions of people had watched the video. Comments poured in. "Incredible. He's a genius. Talent has no uniform." Many shared their own stories of people who had been overlooked because of their jobs, their clothes, or their accents. The noise began to shift. The same. People who had doubted him were now amazed. Reporters requested interviews. Schools from other countries sent invitations. Suddenly, David was no longer just a janitor in a quiet corner of a building. He was a voice the world wanted to hear. Back at the tech center, Layla and David sat in her office, quietly watching the comments scroll across the screen. Neither said much. They didn't need to. They both knew this was only the beginning. Layla finally broke the silence. "You've done more in one speech than some do in a lifetime." David looked at her and said, "All I did was speak. Thank you for listening." Their partnership had begun not with a contract, but with a conversation. And now the world was listening too. The days that followed were unlike anything David Mensah had ever experienced. His story had gone from a quiet corner of a Dubai office to screens all around the world. News channels shared his interview clips. Social media platforms were filled with his videos, and people from dozens of countries were writing messages to say how inspired they felt. Teachers, students, parents, and even strangers were touched by the idea that a man once ignored in the background had so much talent waiting to be seen. Despite all the attention, David remained humble. He still arrived at the office early, still greeted everyone with a smile, and still carried himself with calm dignity. But now people looked at him differently. They no longer saw a man in a janitor's uniform. They saw a teacher, a leader, a reminder of how powerful the human mind could be when given a chance. Layla Al-Mansouri was proud of how far the story had come, but she knew this was just the beginning. While the world was celebrating David's gift, she wanted to make sure something lasting came from it. She gathered her foundation's team and told them it was time to move from planning to action. David's language education program, now called Voices of the World, officially launched as a pilot project. It would begin in 3 countries: Kenya, Bangladesh, and rural Jordan. The goal was simple: help students learn different languages through storytelling, music, and culture, using online tools that were easy to access, even in areas with limited technology. David would design the lessons, guide the teachers, and lead virtual training sessions for local volunteers. As the program gained momentum, some members of the business world raised eyebrows. A few questioned Layla's decision to put a former janitor in charge of such a major project. One investor even asked, "Are you sure people will take him seriously?" Layla answered firmly, "Anyone who hears him speak already does." Still, not everyone shared her vision. One international newspaper published a critical article with the headline, "From Mop to Microphone, Inspiration or Illusion?" Peace questioned David's background and claimed there was not enough proof that he had taught in universities. Some readers began to wonder if the story was too good to be true. David saw the article and quietly closed the browser. He wasn't angry. He had faced doubt before. He understood that when something new rises, it always brings questions. But he also believed that the best answer to doubt is truth, not through arguments, but through action. Layla, however, was not going to let the criticism go unanswered. She arranged a special live broadcast where David would give a short talk and take questions from educators and students around the world. She called it the Language of Hope session. On the day of the event, over 50,000 people joined online. Some gathered in school halls. Others sat in front of laptops or held phones in their hands. Layla opened the session and introduced David once more. Not with titles or achievements, but with one simple sentence: "This man has taught us all to look twice before we judge." Then David stepped forward. He began by thanking everyone, not just for the support, but also for the questions. "Doubt," he said, "is not our enemy. It's a door we must open with truth." He shared his story again, but this time with photos. Pictures of his early days in Ghana, his university classroom, handwritten notes from students, and old certificates. Each image added proof to his words, and slowly, even the skeptics watching began to nod in quiet respect. Then he did something unexpected. He invited students from 5 different countries to speak with him, live on camera. One by one, they asked questions in their own languages: Portuguese, Hindi, Turkish, French, and Korean. And each time, David responded with ease and kindness, speaking their language, pronouncing their names correctly, and making each child smile. It wasn't just a performance, it was a moment of connection, and it left a deep impression on everyone watching. After the session, the comments were filled with praise and gratitude. Teachers asked how they could bring Voices of the World to their schools. Parents wrote that their children felt seen and inspired. Even news outlets that had once doubted the story began to change their tone. One headline read, "The janitor who spoke the world back to life." Despite the growing fame, David stayed true to himself. When reporters asked how he felt about being called the most talented man you've never heard of, he simply replied, "I'm just a man who loves learning and wants to share that love." As the months passed, the program expanded. More countries joined. Young people from villages, towns, and refugee camps began learning their first words in new languages. They were taught by local educators who had been trained by David's team, people who had never thought they'd become teachers themselves. And through it all, Layla and David worked side by side. She handled the business side, funding, partnerships, outreach. He handled the heart of it, lesson design, language coaching, and teacher support. One evening, after a long meeting, Layla sat with David in her office, looking at a world map on the wall. There were pins stuck in different places showing where the program had reached. "You've changed more lives in 6 months than some people do in a lifetime," she said softly. David looked at the map and replied, "No. We changed lives because you believed in something you didn't have to believe in." Layla smiled. "I believed in truth, and the truth spoke 12 languages." They both laughed gently, but inside, they knew this was about more than languages. It was about how a simple act like stopping to listen can unlock something powerful. It was about what can happen when the world takes a moment to see beyond uniforms, accents, or job titles. The journey wasn't over. There was still work to do. But for now, they were proving that one conversation can start a movement, and that greatness often waits in quiet corners, hoping someone will notice. A year had passed since the day Layla Al-Mansouri first heard David Mensah speak in 12 languages. That one quiet moment in the lobby had turned into something greater than anyone could have imagined. What began as curiosity became a life-changing journey for David, for Layla, and for thousands of people across the world. The Voices of the World program was now active in more than 20 countries. Children in small classrooms and community centers were learning languages that once seemed out of reach. In places with no computers, lessons were sent on memory cards or solar-powered radios. Volunteers translated stories into local dialects. Teachers from remote villages were trained online. A few of the students even wrote letters to David calling him Uncle Words or the man who speaks like a song. David read each letter with care. He smiled at their drawings, their questions, and their excitement. To him, these were not just students, they were the future. They were the proof that learning could happen anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. Despite his growing fame, David continued to live simply. He moved into a modest apartment closer to the Foundation's new learning center, where he worked full-time as the director of education. He didn't hire an assistant or drive a fancy car. He still took long walks every morning and greeted people kindly, just like he had when he worked as a janitor. Layla, on the other hand, had expanded her mission too. Inspired by David's story, she started a new project called Hidden Minds. Global search for people with extraordinary talents who had been forgotten or overlooked. Artists, builders, inventors, and teachers were given second chances through small grants and learning opportunities. David helped with that too, sometimes interviewing candidates in their own languages just to make them feel seen and respected. 1. Afternoon, Layla received an invitation for both of them to attend an international education conference in Geneva. She smiled and forwarded it to David, adding a note. "They want you as the keynote speaker." David replied with a simple message. "If one child hears me and chooses to keep learning, I'll go." And so, a few weeks later, David stood on a stage in front of leaders, teachers, and students from all over the world. The large hall was silent as he stepped up to the microphone. There were no flashy slides, no dramatic music, just his voice, calm, clear, and honest. He told his story, not to impress, but to remind the world of something important. He spoke about the strength of quiet people, about the knowledge carried by workers, farmers, and migrants. He shared how, for years, no one asked about his past or his dreams, until one woman decided to listen. Then, in the last few minutes of his talk, he invited the audience to speak with him in their own languages. One by one, people stood up speaking in Italian, Arabic, Korean, Portuguese, and more. And each time David responded, not just with words, but with connection, with warmth, respect, and understanding. When he finished, the room stood up in applause, not loud or wild, but long and heartfelt. Some people wiped their eyes. Others just nodded, deeply moved. After the conference, news of his speech reached even more corners of the world. Universities offered him honorary degrees. Educational platforms wanted to partner with his program. But David chose carefully. He said no to many big offers because he didn't want the message to get lost in fame or money. "I didn't do this to be known," he said to Layla one evening. "I did it so people could remember the power of learning no matter where it begins." Layla nodded. "That's why the world listens when you speak." Months later, something very special happened. The same building where David once worked as a janitor decided to name its new learning center after him. It was Layla's idea, but the entire staff supported it. One quiet morning, a silver plaque was placed on the front wall. It read, "The David Mensa Center for Languages and Learning, a place for every voice." David visited the center that day and stood quietly in front of the plaque. He didn't say much. He just smiled, touched the metal gently, and whispered, "Thank you." That afternoon, a young boy from a local school came running up to him. "Sir, are you really the man who speaks all the languages?" he asked, eyes wide. David laughed, softly. "Not all of them, but enough to help others." "Can I learn like you?" "Yes," David said, kneeling down to meet his eyes. "And maybe one day you'll teach me a new one." The boy grinned and ran back to his class. It was a simple moment, but it held everything that David had worked for: hope, curiosity, and the belief that learning never ends. As the year came to a close, Layla and David sat together once again. Looking at the growing map on the wall in the Foundation's office, more pins had been added. More voices had joined their mission. "This map looks more alive every time I see it," Layla said. David replied, "It's not just a map anymore. It's a classroom without walls." And truly, it was. They had turned one unexpected meeting into a movement. They had taken a quiet voice and made it echo across the world. And they had shown that the most powerful changes often begin not with a loud announcement, but with a small, kind question. "Do you speak Arabic?" Now, millions were speaking and listening, and the story was only just beginning.